If you like this video and want to support the channel, consider subscribing to my Patreon. The link is down in the description. There's a really interesting conversation that happens in the opening hour or so of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 between this guy, Sir Hans Kapon, and this guy, Henry of Skalitz, who is the player character. You're eating at an inn, but you don't have any money to pay for the food that you ordered because of reasons. And the innkeeper tells you that you can work off your bill by hauling some sacks into the inn. Henry asks Hans to help him with the work, and Hans seems totally scandalized by the question, and his response to this really tells you how much homework the devs did when it comes to the historical accuracy of this game. Because Hans says that he can't work. Not just like he doesn't like work or he wants to find a different way to pay off the meal, it's just full stop, I can't do that. The reason being because he is a noble.
Are you yanking my noble pizzle?
So let's talk a little bit about class in medieval Europe. What did it mean to be a noble, and why were they so hesitant to do any sort of labor? In general, people in medieval Europe would have conceptualized society as having three different classes: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. In other words, you had the land-owning nobility, and then you had clergy, priests, monks, friars, nuns, things like that, and then people who labored for a living. This third class is really broad. Most people fell into it. It comprised everybody from the poorest, landless peasant to relatively well-off skilled craftsmen living in big cities. Now, these three classes, in theory, were all supposed to benefit from a series of mutual obligations to each other. The workers, they worked. They made stuff, they picked wheat, shoed horses, ran businesses, things like that. Farmers, butchers, tailors, carpenters, masons, shepherds, all the people who make the stuff that you need in society. Some peasants were legally required to stay on the land that their families had worked for generations. They weren't even allowed to leave without a local landowner's permission, but others were free. They could travel and work as they pleased. In return for their labor, supposedly, this class got certain things from the other classes. Kind of a you scratch my back, I scratch yours sort of deal. Now, for the second class, pretty much everybody in the Middle Ages was religious in some way, but if you loved the game and you wanted to go pro, you would join the clergy. Basically, this was you signing all of your life and all of your work over to the Catholic Church. Just like the first class, there was actually a lot of diversity in the clergy. You had rural priests and people who lived in monastic orders who could appear quite poor. Some of them were itinerant, and so they traveled from place to place. They didn't have a place that they really called home. But on the other hand, you had people high up in the church like bishops and cardinals who, despite technically taking the same vow of poverty that all the other clergy did, they had immense political, social, and economic power. Clergy worked, but they didn't really do the same kind of work that peasants did. Now, because education and religion were basically inseparable in the Middle Ages, clergy were oftentimes teachers or professors at universities. They had jobs preserving knowledge, copying books, studying and writing about history, philosophy, and theology. Their work was more intellectual in nature because they didn't have the same pressures and legal obligations that peasants did. Clergy were also responsible for local religious life and spiritual care. They would preach and pray and visit sick people, and they would offer the sacraments of the church: confession, communion, and baptism, which were all really important to people back then. Really, I cannot stress how important communion was. Multiple wars were fought over communion. Who gets to take it, when they get to take it? Does God become the bread, or does the bread become God? These were very, very big questions back then. Now this brings us to our third category, which is nobles, the category that Hans belongs to.
My noble pizzle.
Nobility was tied to land ownership, and it was hereditary. If your dad was a noble and you were a firstborn son, you were also a noble, and you would get most of your dad's stuff when he kicked the bucket. Nobles had special legal and social privileges. They very much lived by different rules than everybody else. And nobility, crucially, was not something that you could buy with money. This led to a lot of tension, especially in the later Middle Ages, when you had these extraordinarily wealthy merchant and banking families, sort of early capitalists, who exercised immense power and influence, but they were still shut out from these upper tiers of society, which made them, understandably, bitter towards the old nobility. And just like the other two classes, there was actually a wide gap between the wealthiest and most powerful nobles and the ones at the bottom of their class. You could be broke and still be a noble, since nobility wasn't tied to how much money you had, but what you owned and what family you came from. A broke noble was in kind of a strange position because if he wanted to climb the social ranks within his class, it wasn't like he could just go out and get a job. Because remember, nobles were not supposed to labor or make money through wages that were paid to them. Typically, marriage and warfare were the two best ways for a down-and-out noble to enhance the reputation of his family name. You either get hitched to somebody with a better hand, or you go out on a campaign and you take somebody else's stuff. So Hans is obviously mortified when you suggest that he work because that is not his job in society. He's a noble. And in this opening section of the game, I think it does a really great job of portraying what a minor noble at this time in history would have been like. He acts like he is above Henry and his other traveling companions because that is what he has known his entire life. He is entitled to legal rights and social privileges that they are not because of his pedigree, and he doesn't really see anything wrong with that. But he's also not a tyrant either. He has friendly relationships with commoners, especially people like Henry, who he knows. He cracks jokes, he's reasonable, you know, he's a person. Nobles were not so separated from the other classes that they acted like aliens from a different planet. One particular system in the game that also shows the devs' attention to historical detail is the way that clothing and armor works in the game. It's sort of complicated and there's a lot of numbers involved, but the basic gist is that people treat you differently depending on what you are wearing and how well groomed you are. Talk about unrealistic. For instance, some speech checks are easier to pass if you're in full plate mail and you're covered in blood from a recent battle and you look very scary and intimidating, while other things like haggling with merchants are easier if you've recently bathed and washed your clothes and if you are dressed like a noble. This shows up in the opening hours of the game when Henry and Hans, who are on a diplomatic mission, get ambushed by bandits. They try to show up anyways to this castle where they are supposed to deliver this letter. You know, they stink. They look like shit. No horses, no company of armed men, no letter of passage, no nothing, just rocking up to the castle gates. They knock on the castle door and the guards tell them in no uncertain terms to take a hike.
Get your stinking, ragged asses out of here on the double! The pair of you!
Because of course they would. I mean, why would you believe these guys? The fact that the whole first section of the game is centered around trying to build up your reputation and your appearance so that people will believe that Hans is a noble is both a really clever way to introduce the player to the world and these systems in the game, but it also shows a solid grasp on the social fabric of the Middle Ages. This feels like a real, if a little bit sensational, problem that a noble might actually run into given these circumstances. Because in the Middle Ages, the clothes that you wore carried a lot of importance. It wasn't just about protecting you from the elements. Clothing was a sort of identity verification tool as well. If some guy showed up in your village saying he was, you know, the Duke of so-and-so while wearing really expensive clothes, you would be more likely to believe him than if he was dressed like every other dude in the village that you grew up with. People like priests and other religious officials were identified by their clothing, and they had strict rules about what they could and could not wear. Some places even had laws called Sumptuary laws, restricting what clothes people could wear based on their class. This was a measure to try and prevent things like identity theft and fraud. There was a real constant fear in the Middle Ages of things like peasant uprisings, of this strict social hierarchy that they had being turned on its head. And medieval people were well aware of the fact that impersonation, fraud, and identity theft could cause real issues to their sense of order and control. Hence, laws about what you are allowed to wear and how you can dress and who you can say you are. Moving up this hierarchy by impersonating someone, stealing their identity, things like that, was in some ways a lot easier back then than it is now, and it happened more often than you might think. There's a crazy story out of Russia in the early 17th century, which I know is not technically the Middle Ages, but just give me this one, where 3 different guys pretended to be the son of Tsar Ivan the Terrible, and one of them actually got enough people to believe him to be crowned the Tsar for like a year until he got murdered. And speaking of murder, let's talk about those bandits too. In most video games, the bandits around the starting town are basically just piñatas full of gold coins. You go beat them up and you take their stuff. They are never a threat. Bandit in video game terms is basically the same thing as a training dummy. But Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 turns this on its head in a way that is very accurate to the time. Pretty much everybody in Troskowitz is talking about these bandits when you show up, and you get to see just how terrifying these guys are firsthand in the game's opening minutes. They are a menace, and nobody really knows what to do about them. Bandits like this in the Middle Ages were most often trained soldiers who had deserted if a battle wasn't going their way, if they weren't getting paid or fed, or if they just figured they could make bank easier robbing the locals. It's hard to stress just how intimidating a trained soldier back in the Middle Ages was. These guys were strong, athletic, they were very comfortable using violence to get what they wanted. A lot of them were better fed than your typical peasant, and that, coupled with the physical nature of their job, gave them a leg up against your average Joe. The vast majority of workers, farmers, craftsmen, people like that, they lived peaceful lives. I mean, despite the reputation that the medieval period has for bloodshed, at most, a lot of people, maybe you'd get into a bar fight or two over the course of your life, the same way that most modern people are not trained fighters or killers. So it makes sense that the big looming threat in the opening of this game is not some world-ending catastrophe or even a whole army. It's like maybe 10 guys with swords. You would be amazed at the damage 10 guys with swords can do. And as much as medieval people were really invested in this idea of a structured, ordered world with rules and categories for everybody, everything in its right place, the world back then, as it is now, was a much more fluid and complicated place than a lot of people like to admit. Take the traveling Roma characters that you meet in their camp near the beginning of the game. They're led by a man named Voivod, who is the patriarch of this band of nomads. Voivod is the authority in the Roma camp. Whatever he says goes, but he's a bit of a big fish in a small pond. Compared to the dukes, princes, kings, nobles around him, he doesn't really actually have much in the way of power. He does not own land, he doesn't command armed forces, and crucially, he and his family are subject to outright racism that bars them from participating in communal life. And he is aware of this. He tells the player character when you first meet that he is allowed to exist peacefully in Bohemia only because of a letter signed by a local noble that gives him and his camp safe passage and protection. Roma, as well as Jews, who are also featured prominently in this game in the Middle Ages, were viewed with suspicion by many precisely because they were seen as not fitting neatly into this threefold class system. The Roma were not bound to a specific parcel of land like a peasant, they didn't own their own land like a noble, and crucially, while a lot of them were Christian, they were still often persecuted for their beliefs by the church, accused of heresy and witchcraft, despite the fact that folk magic was extremely common among all classes, ethnicities, and religions at the time. Jews likewise were treated as outsiders and blamed for pretty much anything that you can think of. Money problems, disease, war, natural disasters, you name it. Jews at this time more commonly lived in cities, and they would often form enclaves for mutual protection, support, and religious life. And even though lots of medieval Jews were born in Europe to parents who had also been born in Europe, there was a common belief that they were still not like us. However, because of things like climate change, war, economic factors, expanding global trade, and just the fact that borders are fake. They're made up lines on a map. They're not real. European society in the Middle Ages was awash with people from all over the world who brought various religions, practices, beliefs, and history with them. And when you see this sort of diversity, it really puts the lie to what someone like Hans would like you to believe about how neatly ordered society is and how everybody fits into their own perfect little boxes. One of my favorite quests in the game has to do with this Roma camp. You see, Voivod's daughter is missing when we first arrive, and he tasks us with finding her, and over the course of the quest, we learn that she fell in love with a guy from a nearby village and started shacking up together. Voivod, who is worried for his own status, his family's honor, the safety of his camp, sends a messenger to this village to demand that the guy marry his daughter and make it official. The villagers beat the messenger and send him back, and then Voivod's sons take it upon themselves to get revenge. This leads to an ongoing feud between the camp and the villagers, and one of Voivod's sons is murdered in the process. The quest kind of functions as a mission statement for the game's sense of historical accuracy. It's not so much interested in giving you a long list of names and dates to remember, as it is in just showing you how all of these different social and cultural factors influenced people's behavior in a particular time and place. Because everyone in this quest, in their own minds, is acting rationally. Voivod's daughter is trying to protect the man that she loves, the villagers act out of their own sense of close-minded bigotry and fear, and his sons are trying to protect their family's honor. And even you, as Henry, as the player, get to choose what you think is the correct choice here. Are you doing it for money? Are you doing it because you need something from the camp? Because you want Voivod in your debt for some reason? And that's the thing about history. It is full of people who believed that their own actions and perceptions were rational and justifiable. People in the Middle Ages were not stupid. I'm sure we've all seen this graph here, the one that gives every historian in the world an aneurysm as soon as they look at it. The fact is that the men and women who populated the world 1,000, 500, 600 years ago made choices and decisions very much in the same way that you and I do. Will this make me happier? Will it make me safer? Will it benefit my family in some way? Is it a responsibility that I have? Did I make a promise to someone? Does it align with my values? These are the questions that people ask when they're making decisions. The only thing that really changes over time is how social, cultural, and religious norms and practices constrain or direct people towards one answer or another. I think that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is a really great piece of historical fiction in video game form because it sets up a world full of large and small customs, traditions, biases, and beliefs and practices, and it lets these things push the characters in certain ways without ever making them so powerful that it robs the characters of their free will. It lets you see a slice of medieval life through the eyes of more or less a regular person, with all of the baggage, frustrations, and moments of flexibility that they would have actually had. So for that, it gets an A+ from me. The grade doesn't mean anything. I'm not a teacher. Thank you for watching.